Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is JoannaSmolinska, and as Sonia said, I'm the deputy head of the EU office in San Francisco. We have opened the office 2 years ago, September 2022. And specifically, the mission of the office is to explain what the EU does when it comes to digital topics and legislation in these fields. I've been working in the European Commission in the department that proposes laws in the European Commission. It's called Directorate General Connect, DG Connect. And this department gathers people who authored such laws as Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, EU AI Act, Cybersecurity Resilience Act, and Cybersecurity Solidarity Act, to name just a few. Also, copyright issues are being dealt with by this department. It's a very big part of the European Commission and very important because I don't know if you know that the EU as an organization, it's a political organization that gathers 27 member states, and the European Commission is one of its institutions. We are not elected. We propose laws. We are a big group of experts who work on law proposals. We propose laws to the European Parliament and the European Council of Ministers, and these laws are then passed as acts. And so in my department, before I joined the San Francisco office, I've been working on copyright, on platforms regulation, and on the AI regulation. When the work was going on, we left to open the San Francisco EU office. The office in San Francisco is a small outfit. It's a pilot for the European Union to open a second office in a country outside of the EU. We have an embassy in Washington, D.C., but as you may imagine, on the East Coast, we deal with matters at the federal level, colleagues who work there on tech, talk to people and assembly and House and senators at the Hill and their staffers and NGOs. Whilst we're in San Francisco, we're more in touch with obviously the community here. So with the industry, with big and small tech, with universities, and with civil society around issues that are of common interest. And those issues of common interest when it pertains to tech are fundamental rights, protection of users online, promotion of innovation, and so on and so forth. So the way we do it in San Francisco is that we speak with a lot of people. What we do can be summarized as tech diplomacy. So we do not enforce any laws in California, because as much as you might have heard about Brussels effect is rather other countries or other regions adopting the approach that the EU has when it comes to regulating certain matters in digital, and not only, but not enforcing EU laws outside of the EU, because the EU laws only apply in the EU. Obviously, anyone can take inspiration from these laws, and we are very happy when this happens. And this happens a lot in California, not only thanks to the fact that we're here, because before we arrived here, California took a lot of inspiration from the EU, and the EU took a lot of inspiration from California when it comes to, for example, climate and environmental laws. There is a lot of cooperation going on with the environmental agency in California and the EU environmental departments, and member states as well at the national level. So given that the EU has been so active in legislating in these fields, the President of the European Commission and member states thought that it would be helpful to have a European presence here in California. And here we are. And these contacts are very fruitful. We organize lots of policy briefings. We brief both sides, so people who are visiting from Europe and people like ministers and prime ministers and European commissioners on what's happening in Silicon Valley and the other way around. We explain what is done by Brussels, and in Brussels we explain the rationale, we debunk myths and help basically help federate the goodwill around what everyone cares for, which is democracy and protection of fundamental rights and our freedoms on online. So unless you have any questions in this introductory part, I will just go quickly through the PowerPoint. It won't be long. And Sonia, I only see you on my screen, so I'll monitor your body language. If you start waving, it's too much, I'm taking too much time, I'm happy for you to interrupt.
You should be able to change the gallery view so you see all the other students as well. If you do a side-by-side gallery.
Yeah, it's just that I want to look at my slides as well. I only have my little PC with me, so I'm going to change it into it. So if you could see, if anyone wants to stop me, I'm fine with that. I'll find my way back to the slides. So you don't need to wait until the end with questions, okay?
Right.
All right. So the EU doesn't regulate AI only with the EU AI Act. So let's say that the risks online that stem from algorithmic biases, for example, and the way that algorithms are designed are not only regulated by the EU AI Act, but also by recent laws such as the Digital Services Act. For those of you who haven't heard of it, it's a law that has been passed around 2 years ago, and it's in force now. It's important to say it, it's important to mention it, because many risks that you see online on platforms that you're all using, we call them very large online platforms because we designate them, European Commission designates them upon the data of their users that they share, they publish, and when their user base is bigger than 45 million monthly users, they become a very large online platform or a very large online search engine. And it's important to define and designate them because they have more obligations under the Digital Services Act. And one of those, I'm not going to be exhaustive because we don't have time to go through these very complex laws in detail, but I just want you to have an idea of the regulatory landscape that the EU has proposed in the recent years when it comes to regulating in the online sphere. So these very large actors, we designate them as such because they are basically a conduit for us users when it comes to accessing information, sharing information, talking to our friends, accessing services online. And so these companies have to make sure that that basically their use by consumers and by smaller businesses is fair and without or with as little danger as possible. And this is not about censoring internet because Digital Services Act does not define in any way what's illegal and what's legal online. What the DSA does is it introduces a number of checks and balances and due diligence obligations for platforms so that the users are able to easily notify when they think content that they see is illegal. And then platforms have to deal with it. Platforms cannot hide behind the liability shield that they used to have by saying we don't know about the illegal content that is put on our platforms because the content is put by users and by third parties. So once they have knowledge, this has been in place already for 20 years in the EU, but now via another law, but now with the DSA, these obligations have been made operational. And so the biggest platforms have to you see a notice and action system and complaint handling mechanisms in place. They have to provide for annual risk assessments. I think this is of particular importance to you because there are very these risks have been defined and put black on white in the legal act. And as an example, I can mention the spread of illegal content, the risks with relation to protection of minors or gender-based violence, risk pertaining to elections integrity and disinformation. It's important to note that disinformation or misinformation is not defined as illegal in the EU. Some countries may define it as such, but at the EU level, you have only certain categories of content that are defined as illegal in different laws, not in this one. And we actually share these categories with the United States. I'm talking about child sexual abuse material. I'm talking about terrorist material inciting for violence. I'm talking about copyright material and counterfeit goods. There's a lot on this slide that I can share. There are links that you can access if you're like researching this stuff. It's useful, but for the purposes of the class, I'm going to move on. This is about, I cannot see it well. This is about EU AI Act, right? Yeah. So another act that we're talking about here is the EU AI Act. Let's say that it's the act that we will be talking about mostly. And so in general, this is the approach that the EU has taken in regulating AI is we based ourselves on a regulation that is very well known to the industry, and it's product safety regulation, which basically means whatever you put on the EU market you have to ensure that it's safe. And you can do it in different ways. For certain goods, you can do self-conformity assessment, and then you get a CE marking that is then, if something bad happens, checked. The courts will say you have put a CE marking on your product, which indicates to the consumers that this product complies with certain rules as you self-certify, but it's not true. Or, but, you know, this has been like, you've been misguiding your consumers. It's a risk-based approach. Until ChatGPT got published in November 2022, we would say that the EU AI Act only regulates uses, so applications of AI and not the technology itself. You will hear it very often here in California by scientists such as Fei-Fei Li, for example. She's very adamant about not regulating models, so not regulating large language models and underlying so the general purpose AI models. But she says that we only need to look into the uses of AI. This is what the EU AI Act is about, but we also introduced rules for general purpose AI models because we consider that as beneficial as the AI technology can be for many uses, and as much as we cherish and invest in AI innovation, I can speak to that a little bit more if you wish. We see that certain transparency measures have to be put in place so that these models do not basically remain black boxes regulated in a private way by people who have not been elected to protect fundamental rights of people and not of just certain groups of people. Let me put it this very general way. What does it mean that the EU adopted a risk-based approach? It means that this regulation is asymmetrical. You can think about it as a pyramid. On the top of the pyramid, you have a very limited number of unacceptable risk fields. Let's put it that way. I like to call it differently. I like to call it high impact fields, not high risk fields, because recruitment or education is not a risk field in itself. What the legislators meant is that if AI is used for certain, in certain use cases, in certain applications, like social scoring, we in the EU, according to our treaties, according to our fundamental values and Charter of Fundamental Rights, we do not agree with anyone, private or public body, using social scoring to basically establish a certain level of rights for the users of these of certain services. Another example of unacceptable risks, which will be prohibited as of next year, is untargeted scrapping. So when you have the cameras, the CCTV cameras, or they cannot be used to for basically creating undefined databases. Another category of risks is biometric categorization or emotion recognition or individual predictive policing. There are certain exceptions in law, but in general, these are the categories that will be banned, and there is a guideline. There will be guidelines coming out soon. These will be the first guidelines that the Commission will consult on soon. They're not out yet. You cannot see them yet. The Commission is still working on the draft, but it's going to be very interesting, I think, for not only for scholars, but for regulators or like people, legislators who want to regulate this, to see what the EU, how the EU analyzes and how the EU defines the unacceptable risks that should be prohibited when it comes to the AI systems using them. Then you have a big chunk of high risk fields like recruitment, education, medical devices, access to healthcare. And there's a whole Annex 3. You can just Google the EU AI Act and find it. It's a very short, very short. It's just 2-page list of high risk fields where there's going to be more requirements for transparency, for third-party testing, red teaming, technical documentation, and so on. That the providers of such systems will have to show that they have run those tests or they have this technical documentation, and then they can go ahead with deploying such systems. Then you have lower risks where the EU AI Act asks for to provide for transparency, and then you have minimal risks like your Spotify music playlist that Sonia thinks that it can actually be higher risk than minimal risk, right? And why a pyramid? Because the top ones, prohibited risks, are like, there are very limited ones, and they are like the most strictly regulated. That's why they are put in red on my slide. And the Commission has quantified it of all the applications that currently exist and will soon exist. The businesses that are using it, we in the EU AI Act will only regulate in the strictest and a bit lower than strictest way. It's like between 5 and 10% of all the applications. I cannot see my slide. Well, yeah, so these are the high risks. I'm not going to repeat them. I list them for you so that you can, I think it's very interesting to see how the Commission is actually putting it black on white for which risks these systems will have to comply with higher requirements. This list for now is closed, but the Commission gives itself an opportunity to come up with delegated acts to adapt this list if new risks arise and if there is a need to basically update this list. It cannot happen from one day to another, but it will not lead to a very lengthy legislative process because delegated acts are adopted much faster with mandatory public consultation. So you as researchers and NGOs and the whole world can see it because the Commission publishes it for 4 to 12 weeks. And people can give their views, and then the Commission analyzes the responses and takes responses into account, because it's basically the Commission, by consulting the world, gets richer when it comes to our knowledge. There are a lot of people working in the Commission, but the Commission is not pretending that we have the stone of wisdom and that we know it all and we don't have to consult and we're just going to put forward laws and delegated acts. Another dense slide about how we regulate foundation models. I think I'm going to skip it for now because what is more interesting maybe is the comparison with the Senator Winner bill, where I speak about some of those elements. And again, these slides can be shared. I'm only putting on the slides what is publicly available. I'm just summarizing it so that it's easier for you to understand. So
can I just ask a follow-up question before you go into the next topic of comparing these two bills? But when you talked before about not high risk, but actually unacceptable risks, if you go back to that, like, so here you have social scoring, and then you said like next year untargeted scraping. What about the others? Like, is that currently regulated? Is that in place?
Yes. No. So everything that you see on this slide, those examples on the right, those are the examples that are taken from the legal act. It's written black on white that the unacceptable risk uses will be prohibited by February 2025. So no social scoring. And if your system uses social, like leads to social score, or you use it for social scoring, then you're in trouble. And then there's going to be an enforcement action by the European Commission, who is the enforcer of the largest models and high risk AI systems. When I say guidance by February, that means that, so the maybe I'll show you the slide about the enforcement, about the entry into force of the EU AI Act. So the EU AI Act has entered into force August this year. So it is in force, but it will start applying in a staged way. It means that we're going to start the application with the prohibitions. Then 12 months after August, so August next year, supervision of the systemic risk generative AI models will kick in. Then 2 years after August, almost all other provisions. There is another step 36 months after, but I considered it to be a little bit too detailed. So this is not a proposal. This is what you would call an act. It's in force and it starts applying. Now, if you see what I put on the slide about the AI Pact, is something I can explain. It's like voluntary commitments here. Companies come together and say, we're going to start applying the EU certain commitment. We're going to start committing to certain things that are included in the EU Act. What is even more interesting is the work on the codes of practice. And why it's interesting is because some people from the Bay are actually have a very, from the Bay Area here, play a very active role in this work on drafting codes of practice that are starting now. In a nutshell, what the code of practice for general purpose AI models means is that the European Commission said, let's all work together, whoever wants to join, from the industry, from academia, from civil society. There was a call for expression of interest. If you want to join a drafting process to come up with practical ways of implementing the EU AI Act, we're going to call it a code of practice, because some companies already do this. So some companies will tell us, we already label content in such and such way. And these are the ways in which you other companies could do that. So everyone will be now talking to each other and drafting these things until April 2025. And you see it on the slide, it's April 2025, because then in August, these things apply as law. So we want to make it as useful as possible and engage with the industry as much as possible, but in a structured way, not in a way that a bigger company who has more money comes to us and tells us, oh, maybe you guys could ask us to implement it in such and such way because we think it's the best way. No, we're listening to also smaller companies who are like whoever wanted to join. Everyone knew about this. This was public. And so code of practice will be voluntary, but it's a smart way for the regulator to help companies comply and create a presumption of not conformity, but presumption of compliance. So if you say, I'm not part of this code of practice, I don't like this, or I didn't have time to join, but I agree with it. So the Commission will then look into that after April and say, okay, like we analyzed it and we agree that this can be considered as a guidance document for presumption of compliance. If the Commission doesn't like what the Code of Practice group came up with, they will say, okay, we're taking this and these parts, but it's not sure that if you're like comply with the Code of Practice, you will be considered. It's not a rubber stamp. The only rubber stamp is their own self-compliance with the letter of law as defined in the EU AI Act, because this is the way law works everywhere in the world. Then it's to the courts to establish whether a company breached that law or not. Okay?
Thanks. Yep.
So back to our, yeah, I'm stuck now. Page up. Yeah, Senator Wiener. You probably have heard about this bill. SB 1047, a very interesting bill. Not, I don't want to say not at all as an EU AI Act, but some opponents would say this is even stricter than the EU AI Act, which might be in certain, when it comes to certain provisions. Why is it interesting? So you know that is, you know or you don't know. There was a bill called Safe and Secure Innovation for Frontier Artificial Intelligence Models Act that Senator Wiener, a Democrat from California responsible for San Francisco, put forward. It passed the Assembly and Senate in California during the summer. And so it went together with other 30 AI bills to the desk of Governor Newsom, and Governor Newsom has signed 18 AI bills last September, but he vetoed the Senator Wiener's bill that aimed at regulating AI foundation models. There are similarities between the Senator Wiener bill and the executive order of the Biden administration, also because the Biden administration took a lot of inspiration from the California executive order. And when you look at the definition of the foundation models in scope, the quantitative thresholds are the same as in the executive orders, so 10 to 26 flops, floating operation points. It's a measure of compute. Senator Wiener added a monetary threshold, so it's a foundation model that is as capable as that uses a compute power that costs at least 100 million US dollars and uses a compute power that is as high as or higher than 10 to 26 flops are in scope. In the EU, we define this model just a little bit lower, at one integer lower, so at 10 to 25, because at the time when the law passed, 10 to 26 would have meant that law would not apply, that this part of law would not apply to any of the existing models. Whilst for now, I cannot say it because I'm part of the European Commission, but now, at least currently, you can read it in research papers or in the press, that there are a few that would fall under the EU AI Act threshold. Another notable difference with the definition in the EU AI Act is that we're also using qualitative indicators to identify those most capable and systemic risk prone foundation models, and Senator Wiener does not include it, which arguably makes his bill less stringent than ours when it comes to that. But this is also what Governor Newsom criticized. What Newsom said is that this way of defining the most capable models is too stringent and not stringent enough, because it does not cover models that are less powerful when it comes to flops, because they might be using less compute, but they might be very capable when it comes to generating harmful outputs. And less powerful models, for example, are used for governing the electricity grid in California. And they would not be regulated. So the way Governor Newsom phrased his veto is very interesting, because he said, I'm not going to sign this bill as is, but please don't say that California should not regulate foundation AI models, because I think we should. But I want to do it based on evidence. I want to create a group of wise women and men, and Fei Li is part of it, to come up with criteria that would help regulating foundation models in a more flexible way than the Senator Wiener bill. Another thing that people got, that I would say people demonized a bit the bill about, was the liability. because the bill includes liability obligations that raise liability risks for those big model developers who would then, if open source models would then, if open source, if downstream deployers would then use those big models, they would be liable for the harmful outputs. And so that means that if you're like a smaller company, you would not want to use those open source models because you would be scared about the liability risk. Another thing is the kill switch that the bill required. And these things are different in the EU AI Act. So I'm at the same time comparing it with the EU AI Act and telling you about the main criticism. The kill switch, we don't have it in the EU AI Act. The bill, Senator Winner's bill would require that there are shutdown capabilities if there are like new threats to public safety and security. It's not sure that these capabilities actually exist yet. And another interesting thing that the bill doesn't do and the EU AI Act does is that we exclude from the regulation scope the systems that are used exclusively for military and national security purposes and research and scientific purposes. So this is a big thing for researchers and for defense. You can then, have a philosophical discussion whether it's good or bad, but we exclude those uses to not over-regulate, actually. And oversight in the EU is done by the European Commission. The opponents of SB 1047 were saying that we need to deal with it at the federal level, not at the state level. But this is a bit of a vicious circle, because if there's no regulation at the federal level, you need to do something at the state level, and California always did. And we hope they will continue doing so. I'm not going to go through all the bills that have been signed into law, but be aware that there have been many, and many of them are covering the areas that the EU AI Act also covers. But the way that California is regulating AI is different in many ways from what we do in the EU. In the EU, we bet on one overarching act, whereas in California, different senators and different assembly members bet on certain areas like healthcare services, or transparency of generative AI models, or digital replicas. So the copyright issues, that the AI can use your digital likeness, but you need to, but the providers of AI systems that want to do that have to come into agreements with the artists that they want to use the faces of the body, the digital likeness of their voice, so that the artists are actually fairly remunerated. You have heard about the Hollywood strikes. This has been heavily lobbied by the trade union SAG-AFTRA of the artists, and they made it, at least in California. Interesting bills about defending democracy and deepfake deception. So you have deepfakes are dealt with in one of those bills. Another watermarking bill has not passed through the Assembly and the Senate. It was a little bit too detailed for them, and it might come back. But another deepfake and watermarking bills have passed, so that's good news. So in the EU AI Act, just to emphasize it, we deal with those real and documented risks when it comes to biases and algorithmic biases and deepfakes by requiring that the data sets used for training the biggest models are of high quality, and we require to document it in the technical documents. We require watermarking, but not in a detailed way. There's going to be guidance at some point, because it was too early to come up with any detailed rules on this. And you have mandatory disclosures when it comes to transparency. So people need to know that they're interacting with chatbots and not humans, for example, just to say one of many. Okay, we've been through the slides.